Move approval.
Moved by Michael, is there a
I'll second.
second by Will? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. We're gonna jump to item 5, a discussion of the role of the school resource officer. And we're privileged tonight to have Nate Seiler with us. So Nate?
Is this on?
It is.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. My name is Nate Seiler, one of the lieutenants in the Investigations Bureau at the Wausau Police Department. One of my roles includes supervision of our school resource officer program and liaison with the admin at Wausau School District. I've been in this position since 2017 now. And so currently we have 4 school resource officers. We've had 4 since I began. And only one of those have changed out since I started. So we have 1 in each of Wausau East and Wausau West high schools. That's Officer Jeff Schremp and Officer Nick Stetzer. And then we have Officer Kuatau at Horace Mann Middle School and Officer Kevin Cornell at John Muir Middle School. So we also have 9 elementary schools within the city limits, and so the school resource officers often go out to assist as needed at those schools, but also just to provide general support for school counselors out in elementary schools and just relationship building with those students. So school resource officer program started in the early 80s here in Wausau with just 1 officer. It was actually former Chief Hardell was the first school resource officer here in the city. Since then it grew little by little. We had 2 school resource officers when I started in 2005. It went to 3 and then up to 4 about 2016 in discussions with the school district and altering some things such as the DARE program and replacing that with the whole program for the elementary school students. So with 4 SROs, we also then upgraded that to not upgraded, but the district really wanted to have those as uniformed officer positions. They used to be plainclothes before that, but they really thought it was important to have a uniformed officer in the building along with having a marked squad car parked out in front of the building just as for that physical safety and security and reassurance to parents and so forth. So, so the primary objectives of the school resource officer program, really number 1 is building trust and relationships with students. Physical security and safety is certainly important. That's been certainly on the more forefront in the last few years, but we find that relationship building and building trust with students is really what complements safety and security because we have that buy-in from students and staff. We have that community policing model there in our schools, and it really impacts that quality of life with the perception or the level of fear of safety or security or fear within the building. So having them there in the building we think really impacts that, just like the same model that we use here citywide. So with that community policing philosophy, we find that our students really embrace that. They feel ownership in the security of their building. We have a lot of tips that come into our school resource officers as a result of the relationship building and getting to know the kids and being in the building. They all have offices right within the building that are accessible to students, open door policy that students are accessible to them at any time as well as staff for a variety of reasons. Just to provide support. So definitely not so much a focus on enforcement. It's really just there as an advocate, support for students, a resource for staff and students on any legal issues in the building, and obviously there for protection and security. Our SROs, I think we have a unique model here in Wausau. Some places, the SROs really can sometimes just be an armed security guard, and the police department really controls what they do. And they're just there they're going to take on an investigation if something comes up. But our officers are really involved, and they're not just stuck in the buildings. They use those relationships they build as part of the investigative staff to do the sexual assault investigations, all the child-sensitive crime investigations. When that information comes to them in the school building, they're going out and doing the follow-up because they have that rapport with the students and the families. And that's the best service that we can provide to the victims, and they become very skilled as part of the detective bureau to go out and do those investigations all the way through to helping with the forensic interviews at the Child Advocacy Center to really be there, support, and assist that victim. And they're a face that that victim then knows in school throughout the school year and helps that child through some of their struggles there in the building. So, and that's part of why it's a cost sharing agreement as opposed to some SRO models where the school district is paying 100% for that officer. We've seen that as well, where that officer is in the building and the school now controls them. They're our person, they don't get to leave the building, we want them there all the time. And if there's something that comes up investigative-wise, you need to send that out to detectives. We don't really operate like that. We think our model is a little better in having those officers involved in those investigations and supporting students. So the cost is 50-50 between the city and the Wausau School District every year. That's the way it's been run ever since I've been here. We formalized that into writing, into a contract now within recent years, splitting those wages and time. The school district does pay 100% for any school event overtime. So football games, prom, homecoming events, parent orientation, things like that, where they will pay 100% for that SRO to come in their building after hours or at a school activity and provide that service. So with that contract we have with the school district, we do follow best practices from Wisconsin DOJ and the federal government in terms of having a written agreement as far as what the roles and responsibilities are of the SRO. One of the most important things is how school discipline is handled, and so that it's not law enforcement that is going to be there to deal with school discipline, and sometimes that can get out of whack. And so best practice is to have that in writing so it's very clear and delineated as to the officer role versus school discipline role. And that is in our contract that really outlines for teachers and staff, school discipline is for you, and if we need to get involved, it'll be at your request to assist that investigation. So that includes things like in our contract, for example, what might be a crime out in the community, low-level misdemeanor type offenses, whether it's disorderly conduct, theft, property crimes, things like that. Best practices, that is within the purview of the school to deal with that school discipline and doesn't necessitate an officer coming to the building. So we really, we stick to that, and the schools handle a lot of those matters on their own. And we may get involved later on if it's a repetitive activity and social services is involved, and if there's a repeat behavior that we can do a referral on to get more services. Talk a little bit about training. SROs, obviously, they get the same standard training as our patrol officers in terms of regular in-service and skills training and things like that, but they certainly gain a lot additional training, and we agree with that in the school district that it's important that they have additional training to provide that service in the schools. All 4 of our SROs are certified through the National Association of School Resource Officers through their 40-hour basic course to begin with, but more of their training that we see year to year is based on, it's not the security and the enforcement, we do some of that, but it's really focused on mental health, student support, how do we work well with school counselors and pupil services to provide support for students. So everything from, as examples, autism awareness for law enforcement, the crisis intervention team training, they all have the 40-hour CIT course, adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed care. The school district embraced a Leader in Me training for their school staff coming into this year, which was a book with 7 habits of highly effective people and how we implement that in school culture. Our SROs this summer were all given that book. Like, you're there with staff, you're gonna read that book and you're gonna go through the training with them, so you're hand in hand with school staff and you're part of that team. So we do a lot of joint training with school staff, in around things like decriminalizing mental health. That was something we did 3-4 years ago along with our crisis process improvement program, where counselors and social workers and school resource officers are all in the same room together to make sure we're on the same page on how to handle mental health crises in the school. We do partner with them in the security, safety side of things as well, on school evacuation, emergency planning, reunification, ALIS training, which is active shooter response. Our SROs are trained as instructors so they can help staff know best practices and how to go about that, do refresher training. We have school staff turnover year to year, so our SROs are in those buildings and they're able to help those staff understand those concepts. One thing that's also unique that helps us is that some agencies will have a sunset as far as the SRO tenure. Sometimes it might be 4 years and you're out and you rotate. We've stood by as long as the SROs they're doing a quality work, they're showing that they are there for the right reasons, and the schools and the school district is on board with those officers. We find that long-term relationship, working relationship with the school staff, the teams, their ability or the repetitions, like that's invaluable to us. So we have great officers in there. One has been in there for, I think the longest one right now has been in there for 9 years. That's Jeff Stremp at Wausau West. And Officer Cornell, as an example, he started in 1993. He just became an SRO in 2017. And he'll be ending his career in there. And he says it's the best career move he's made, and he enjoys it and wishes he would have done it sooner. As you know, we do have the 2 therapy dogs that started in 2017 as a pilot program with Officer Stetzer and the school district, who of course was right there with us when let's see how we can get creative in handling mental health in our schools, and partnering with the healthcare center on how do we reduce mental health detentions, especially across youth, and the impact of hospitalization and what that does to that child. And Officer Stetzer took it to that next step with, well, here's how I think I can do something with my dog, and who was currently a pet at the time, and got him trained. And at the time, Wausau East, the year before, had 12 emergency detentions where kids were physically removed from that building, taken to the healthcare center, and were hospitalized. After introduction of the therapy dog, the following year, that number went down to 8, then down to 5. The last 3 years, we're at 0. We don't, as one component of, along with CIT training and partnerships with staff, it's not fully responsible for that, but we think it's a big part of why, students, when they're having problems, we have that relationship now. They're coming to Officer Stetzer ahead of time. They're coming to, they see him as a resource, not just as a, somebody who's going to react to them in crisis. So we're really happy with that. And in the last 3 years, we've only had, Wausau West, we've only had 1 in the last 3 years as far as emergency detention out of building. In the middle schools, we only had 1 last year. There are instances where kids will end up at crisis stabilization, but not necessarily all the way through to a 5115 emergency detention. So from time to time, a student may be removed from the building just to be stabilized and to utilize the youth hospital, but we certainly try to implement parents, other modes of travel, and not make that a school resource officer where we're, putting a kid in the squad car wherever possible. It's been, especially with some of our, within our special education departments, they're really appreciative of the dogs. And it's not just if the school had a dog, but as an example, in Wausau West, when we first got Theo in there, we had a very 6'3" tall senior, very physically intimidating, on the autism spectrum, and would destroy property when he was in crisis. He would go after teachers, things like that. And what a difference when he's in crisis, we just bring the dog down and it stops all that. And now with the officer there, we can go a step further. We can engage in safety planning, like, hey, Danny, next week, Officer Stremp tells him, hey, if you're good, if you're respectful of your teachers, use your coping skills. And next week, you can come with me. We'll go patrol, the parking lot, the hallway. Come with me and Theo. I need your help. And it really reduces some of the frequency of crisis just by having Jeff there, the dog, and having that relationship with the student. Outside of school, there's plenty of things they still engage in during the summer. The school resource officers are involved with the cadets program, which is formerly the Explorer Post. So they run that program where we have high school kids who are interested in law enforcement, kind of like Explorer Post was an extension of the Boy Scouts, but it's a law enforcement education program for young people. During the summer, that's when they're going to use a lot of their vacation bank off time because we really want them in buildings. We try to minimize the amount of off time they use during the school year. So during the summer when they are on duty, however, we use them a lot for community events, community relations. The therapy dogs are great for critical incident response, even if it's just we have a major case and we have victims or a search warrant with children in the home. We can bring them in and we've used the dogs that way and have been a great resource to mitigate some of the impact on children in homes under dire circumstances. They partner with social services and child protective services to go out on calls to homes from CPS complaints and engage in those investigations. They're involved with the HOPE program, which they go to all the elementary schools during the school year and educate fifth graders on things like internet safety, good or safe peer relationships, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, things like that. Our SROs lead our restorative justice program for youth. So when we do have referrals, a large majority of those are, we partner with social services for diversion. So we have restorative justice program with Goodwill, where they can get into community service opportunities instead of moving forward into the criminal justice system. Along with that, we have a teen driving conferencing program and vaping conferencing, where we bring students who are referred, whether it's a municipal traffic citation or they're caught with vaping devices or tobacco at school. Instead of just going down a fine route, we bring them in. We have a conference with multiple officers who can have a group conversation about the dangers of that kind of activity and share ideas about how they can do that better and be safe. So we have that right in our public conference room over at the police department. Use of force is really rare in our buildings with our officers. And I went back and pulled our SROs just to make sure, like, if I wasn't missing anything, because I reviewed the reports. And it is, in terms of use of force in some sort of, like, as a result of a criminal event, just it doesn't really exist with us. Officer Shrimp, for example, he's been there 9 years, and I poked his brain. I mean, when's the last time he used force? The last time is with a freshman with some mental health issues who had a pair of scissors in a room, came at a teacher, and then came at Officer Shrimp and Theo with the pair of scissors. We've seen other instances where that could be a deadly force situation where a firearm has been used. It didn't amount to that here. I think our officers are well trained in use of restraint and making good common sense decisions. We're able to avoid that situation and had to take that child into custody for his protection and ultimately for detention. But otherwise, in 9 years, he has not had a use of force incident at Wausau West High School where he's had to go hands-on. Not to say there aren't fights or disturbances at a school, but a lot of times that's resolved or separated by teachers. And now we're going to work with those students on, it might be a restorative justice program, it might be a referral, it might be just talking with the parents. Wausau East, we had only one instance last year, and that was with a 14-year-old, again, with extreme mental health, behavioral, some concerns at home, and left the school building after making threats to harm himself. So that was something that Officer Stetzer had to go out and find him and handle and take him into custody outside the building. As far as arrests, our policy and procedure within best practices, that's an absolute last resort on school grounds to take someone into custody. When we do have to do it, our policy dictates that we're supposed to do that in basically the least impactful way possible, out of sight, come up with a plan, build a rapport with the student, explain things, not just go and put someone in custody. And within the last 2 years, there's only been 4 in-custody arrests within our buildings. And all 4 of those occurred at Wausau East because 3 of them were at the charter school where we have some at-risk kids. And those are a result of social services with a capias, like knowing the child was there and gave orders with a capias that the child be picked up. Those did not involve use of force, but Officer Stetzer is well versed in, I'm going to sit down with the student, explain the process, be thorough with, here's how this is going to go. I got the car out back here. We're going to go this route. We're going to stay out of sight, answer any of his questions, and gain his cooperation. We just don't go throw handcuffs on people. So,
John, can I ask
Yep.
a follow-up question on that?
Yeah.
Real quick? I don't mean to derail your presentation, but
No problem.
in that situation, you use this SRO to initiate the arrest, not another officer?
Correct.
And you think that's the best approach in a situation like that?
I mean, as far as repetitions and knowing how to handle that student, yes. I think this in the school generally agrees with that. Certainly there's days where the SRO might be sick or gone or at training, and you do have to have a patrol officer that goes there and handles that. But if social services is asking us to pick up a kid, we also look at, does it need to happen right now? Does it need to happen when the kid's in math class? No. We're going to wait till 3:30 before the kid goes home. We're going to let him get his school day in. And the SRO has a relationship with the teacher and the student and has that rapport to be able to I can sit down and have a conversation with the student who I already know. I'm going to gain his compliance. As you have a patrol officer that shows up who the kid doesn't know, you increase the chances of a use of force incident dramatically. That kid's going to be on edge. He's not going to know the officer. There's a sense of distrust about law enforcement for that at-risk kid who's had some negative contacts in the past. So absolutely, we want it to be that SRO because as it shows, it results in we invest a little more time talking with the student, and we don't have to use force to get him to comply. So.
Oh.
In the use of force is probably more common in the middle schools, and again, that is when we've had some escalation of kids in crisis, attacking a teacher or in a physical struggle with a teacher, and it's usually in the course of helping that school staff in a course of restraint of that student, which as much as possible, we try to de-escalate that there. There's been instances where the officers had to put the child into handcuffs in that spot, in that room after it's been evacuated, just to get him to stop that violent activity, try to get him to calm down. It doesn't necessarily mean we got to take him to the healthcare center, but we contact the parent, work it out, put the time into it with de-escalating that child, and oftentimes he can still stay in the building. And that's with those years of experience. Officer Cornell has been in this for 5 years now. He knows that this kid likes Pokemon cards. He knows he's talked to the parents. He knows what is going to calm this child down. A patrol officer coming in isn't going to know that at all. They've built a lot of relationships with elementary school students who they know have struggles. Sometimes they're repeat calls where they can go in, and the officer often can go in because now the teacher might be crying under duress after this emotionally escalated situation she was in and just doesn't know what to do at the time. But an officer can come in fresh, one of our SROs, and know how to calm that student and know what is going to calm them down. So that keeps kids in the building far more than it used to. When we do end up referring any students on criminal charges, it's always 3-4 steps down the line. So initially it's always going to be for property, non-person crimes, or even maybe a fight. It's always going to be school discipline as the first resort. After that, it could be a citation. It could be a referral to social services. However, for us, we have a very close relationship with social services as well. Greg Jen, our intake worker, is on first name basis with all our school resource officers. They can talk to him about any student and their history and what makes sense for this individualized student. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. They have set up a diversion program with social services. So statistically, you look at a referral, it has to have a criminal charge attached. And so you might see, here's all these referrals, and that looks high, but social services is the avenue or the means by which we can provide diversion programming, because by doing that referral with a charge on it, that gives social services the authority to implement these programs, to require follow-through on it, where students may not participate if it's voluntary. So even though there's a referral going over, only a very small fraction actually ever make it to the DA's office. The vast majority of them go to social services, and they use a variety of programs to include the restorative justice, the diversion pilot, which we have for disorderly conduct, and THC. And it's spelled out for our officers. The first referral, it is social services sends a letter to parents describing available resources, and that's it. There's no exposure to the actual criminal justice system. The second referral, it's a letter and a citation is requested. So the second time around, social services tracks it and it comes here with a municipal citation. If it's a third referral for similar activity, now social services will do an intake call, bring in the parents and the child for a meeting to talk about, really, this is your last chance. Like, what can we come up with, conditions, services, connect you with services to try to mitigate this. The fourth referral, they'll actually schedule a meeting with parents, and at minimum, it's still like a fourth chance. They're at least going to do a deferred prosecution agreement with the DA's office. So it's still not actually prosecuting them in that moment. So it's very rare that we actually get to the point of opening a file on a student for some of the stuff that happens within our school buildings. So outside of those, the more common thing we might refer a student for would be a sexual assault. All of those reports have to go to the DA's office for review. but those still aren't custodial arrests for students. And a lot of them are, they might be that voluntary contact where it's just an underage sexual activity type of complaint, but those still get referred because it's through social services that those sex education services are provided. So we have to provide that referral with a charge on it so that social services has the authority to make sure they follow through on that kind of programming. When I looked at 2019-2020 school year, because this past school year was a little bit of a, without students in buildings, so I tried to find the best reference point. So 2019-2020 school year, the school was out for COVID as of March, so we at least had fall and a little bit into the spring. So just as an example, if you have some questions on these, like the most common type of citation would be tobacco on school premises, or tobacco paraphernalia, THC paraphernalia, truancy to help try to get that student back in school as the most common type. The most common type of referral would be disorderly conduct. And again, that goes through that diversion process though. So even though it's a referral, it's not something that's actually getting prosecuted. So.
And how many would that be made in a given year?
So for that school year, the total across the 4 SROs, there was 67 referrals to social services or the DA's office, because let's say you have a 17 or 18-year-old, that referral is going to the DA's office. So that does go direct to them. However, the DA's office, again, is using, they're looking at deferred prosecution agreements, consent decrees, things like that. They're going to work with that parent and that child to find out what services are needed, because the court's already clogged up as it is. We don't need to put this child through this if we can find another option. Citations, they had 52 citations across the 4 SROs last year. And speaking with Greg Jen at Social Services, this diversion program has been in place for about 3 years now. Social Services reports they're very happy with that program. They see a lot of reduction in recidivism. Like they saw a large reduction in repeats. He didn't have a number for me, but he's very happy with the THC diversion program, which is, again, it's a letter. The second time around, it's the youth is requested to participate in a mental health and drug screening. And then the third referral for THC or paraphernalia, it's an intake meeting with the parent and deferred prosecution. But a lot of times that first referral, which is just a letter to a parent and the conversation with the parent, they're finding does what they want it to do, which is keeping kids from being exposed to the criminal justice system. The final thing I'll share with you just on this point of training and kind of where that's evolved in the last, at least how I think the last few years. Again, sir, there's a big push towards active shooter, armed intruder type training for officers, and that's important. And we still do that, and we help train school staff. We train with the fire department on rescue task force and how we respond to those incidents. But in more recent years, Wisconsin DOJ, with the Office of School Safety that was created about 3-4 years ago now, has been a great training resource on mental health issues and more so student wellness type training. So as an example, just this past year, the trainings that our SROs are attended, going down his list here of many pages, but operational considerations for schools through the pandemic, the role of police in our schools, addressing LGBTQ plus student safety concerns in schools, disrupting systemic racism in schools, a local LGBTQ youth training, adolescent mental health, culturally responsive school safety panels, school safety security measures around racial disparities and implicit bias, social emotional learning for reopening schools, and then as well as a lot of like First Amendment student rights around being able to protest at school. So working with our school staff to have a plan in place to make sure that, First Amendment rights are respected and that they can plan accordingly for a student protest. Which those kind of trainings weren't available 3, 4, 5 years ago, so a lot of that stuff is coming around a lot more, and they're much more capable to be able to work with our school staff to address, students that are struggling in school and at home. And again, I think we invest that time with them, which I think it would be a bad move to, hey, 4 years in and you're done. When we have good people in there, we want to keep them there. And I think the school district feels the same. I'll close with, the feedback I get from the district has always been positive on the admin side of things. So the most recent example, and we have our Guardian tracking program at the police department where we provide evaluation for our employees. And of course, I grab any feedback, good or bad, from the schools and add it to that. But Wausau East High School principal right now is Cale Bushman. Mr. Bushman was the associate principal at Wausau West for a number of years, back before I got in this role. And so he had a long working relationship with school resource officers. And his comment here in start of school year, which was unsolicited, was saying, hey, I just wanted to take a second to let you know how fantastic Nick Stetzer is as an SRO. Wausau has been spoiled by having great SROs in our buildings, and Nick is no exception. I've been so impressed by Nick's positive attitude, demeanor, de-escalation tactics, and connection with students. He is excellent. Great judgment, tact, and common sense are involved in all of his decision-making. East is really lucky to have him working here. Just wanted to pass that along and thank you for your partnership. So he had worked with Officer Jeff Strump for about 3-4 years, I think, before he took his next role. Mr. Bushman was instrumental in some of our truancy programming here and diversion programs of social services. So he's a great asset here. We have a lot of great school admin that we work with and partner with, and that I'm in contact with on a weekly basis on what our program is and how we can continue to do the best we can and improve.
I just want to say, so I have 3 kids in the district. My oldest is on the spectrum, and she and Officer Stetzer are close. She was, a couple years ago, there was an incident at Horse Man with a threatening note, and that created a change in schedule, and Stetzer was there with the dog and did amazing work. And so just a great resource that I think we overlook when we look at the mental health and sort of the anxiety and new schools and things. And then Horseman, Officer Tao, a great asset there as well. Interacted with my kids. There was a bullying issue with my daughter who has dwarfism and was being teased and online, and he stepped in and this was during virtual learning, came to the house. And so I think when we look at the data where we see that younger folks aren't having that connection, investment in this type and these formidable years might be an area for us as a task force to recommend. I have one question, would be, as a task force, we get to make some recommendations. Are there areas in your experience that you would say we should look at investing further or promoting more in the school resource officer sort of program?
Sure. I mean, school staff will tell you, especially elementary schools, is when do we get our officer or when do we get our dog? There's a high demand, and I think that's a credit to those officers that respond to school staff the best they can, even if they can't get there, they're answering the phones and so forth. Sometimes it's the running joke, like, when are we going to get a roaming SRO for the elementary schools? And like, well, I don't know if that's the best option as opposed to additional. What's been really helpful to them as an asset and support services is just more crisis professional people, some in that realm of things, like kind of like what we have with the CART program, but more people that can, whether it's a school district employee or the healthcare center, like how do we get more support for our youth that can partner with our officers? Because I think we have a good balance. I don't think we want a swarm of uniformed officers roaming around our buildings in that respect and responding to every elementary school thing. But, you know, I wasn't prepared for that question. I think our guys have the tools that they need. I think the dogs are a great asset. I would resist getting a therapy dog for all 4 of them. Part of that is for the middle school officers, they are by far the busiest of any officer in our department. When you look at reports and what they're engaged in on a given day, and having to go out to elementary schools, like the dog would very much slow them down. And I've proposed to the district, like, if we're going to have more therapy dogs, like, this would be the time for the district. Now, you pitch in your side. This would be a good opportunity to have a dog with a district aide who can kind of go around building to building, have a good relationship with the officer. Mosney, for instance, has a dog, and they assigned it to a school staff's person. So I think it is important to have some partner with their officers like we have them now. But I'm glad that when we started this, it landed in the high schools. They will go out as needed. Like, the high school officers have responded to elementary school if the middle school officers aren't available, and it's come in handy. But I think it's like, how can we support the school to provide more of that type of resource that our officers can partner with, whether it's in crisis services for youth. Obviously, everyone loves dogs. But I would not really buy into, here's another dog for all of our officers and everything that comes with that, including from a cost perspective to the city. So,
Any other questions? Pat?
Yeah, thank you. It's been most enlightening. One of the early things you said piqued my curiosity about when an offense at school becomes a police matter. And I'm wondering if you could kind of maybe give some examples of things, a theft or maybe an assault or something like that in the school that is handled. And I'm all for, it sounds like you're making perfect sense in terms of trying to avoid giving the student a police record.
Sure.
And it sounds also like when possible, you run them through municipal court rather than county circuit court?
yes, yep. Citation would be the next step up after, if school discipline isn't appropriate for a variety of reasons. So as far as examples, so like property crimes, if another student is a victim, like their phone was stolen or something like that, restorative justice would be a great option, right? Because they can do apology letters and community service. We're going to make sure that student family is reimbursed for the stolen item, and then they can complete that program. And if they complete it, then there's no citation, no other criminal penalty as long as they complete that and obviously show remorse and the victim is satisfied with that. If a lot of times we have school property that is damaged, certainly the school is, our district has been very good about, okay, how can we, they don't criminalize that for the most part unless it's a repeat behavior, something that's very intentional or an act of violence. If there's mental health issues involved, I mean, that's just not something they do. They don't come running to us for a police report on a damage to property. So this recent social media trend where kids are damaging bathrooms and so forth, like, we had some media requests, like, what are you guys going to do about this? And what do you do with kids that do this? And it was like, first and foremost, that's a school discipline issue. It's their property. They get to, have obviously determine what the deterrence is and what they're going to do about it. They did warn the students, like, this is something that could get you in trouble with law enforcement. We may refer you to that. But school discipline is always the first option. Disorderly conduct, where it's just swearing, being obnoxious, pushing and shoving, something short of a felony battery assault. Again, that could be restorative justice. If it's somebody that they've already have a track record at the school of, hey, we've tried this service, we've connected them with this resource. They are not willing to go through these restorative options we have for them in building, and they're just resistive to that. Like, okay, well, then the next step is a citation. If they have a social worker, sometimes it is a fast track to social services to put some conditions in place for that.
And you can involve parents in this pretty quickly, it sounds like.
Absolutely, and that is always a first stop, even before, if the school decides they want the SRO to look at this and get involved with it, we still have to make sure that the parent is aware before we're speaking to the child on that. So,
I'm super excited to share with you what we've been up to over the last year.
Great. Thank you. So one of the matters that you would take into account would be the value of the item. Say if it's a theft. If it's a pencil, it's one thing. If it's a $400 cell phone, it's another.
yep. Right, and I can think of instances where we've done a referral where it is, it's blatant, it's intentional, and they've exhibited this type of behavior before, that we've done a referral, but it still doesn't, for property crimes, it doesn't go to the DA's office. It's going to go to Greg Jen at Social Services. He's going to have an intake meeting with the student and the family to talk about what are you willing to do as far as restoring what you did, and are you willing to be remorseful? Are you willing to work this off? Is there any mental health concerns that we gotta deal with? Is it a AODA issue that you need treatment for? Is there something going at home that's playing into how you're behaving at school? We're investigating all those things to how do we provide services to the student so that he doesn't make these decisions at school. That's always the first line of thought. And for property crimes, I don't see it going, it does not go to the prosecutor to get charged. If you have felony, now we got multiple felony burglaries and things like that, it might, but a lot of it depends on the cooperation of the student and the parents in that situation. What is their willingness to try to do better and comply with social services conditions?
So one of the upshots of this is if the individual who is dealt with by the SRO for some offense at the school applies for a job when he or she is 19 years old and somebody runs CCAP on him, it's not going to show up.
Right.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Good.
So there's been discussion about trying to establish some minimum qualifications for SROs on a nationwide basis, but you indicated that yours are all credentialed or certified through a program.
Yes.
Where do you see the department being relative to those efforts to bring some uniformity in minimum training?
Oh.
Exceeding those?
By far. Actually, so I did see that proposed legislation in Wisconsin, and everything that I saw, they were actually going to refer to, NASRO is the most recognized organization that provides that basic certification training that's been around for many, many years, more than a decade, and they're recognized as providing that basic certification training. So at least in the state of Wisconsin, there is nothing else that would qualify under the terms that they provide there as far as training. With legislation around the country, maybe there will be more opportunities for that, but that's what's recognized as the basic, here's the 40-hour course. If you want to be an SRO, best practices, you should have attended that and done that. Our current staff all worked multiple years before they ever did that, but I think having them in their roles as long as they've had been in there, we are in high demand for our officers to be presenters and instructors at various trainings. They've presented at the state SRO conference for the last 3 years in a row on various topics. Greg Jen from Social Services partners with them in those conferences. Greg Jen then takes them to the social services conferences down in Madison and talks about diversion programs. And here's how we engage in our school building. So when last year, when Wisconsin DOJ, because they saw the legislation coming, put out an announcement saying, we have grant money to provide training for school resource officers. This is what's going to comply with that proposed legislation. So we're going ahead and we want to get as many SROs up to speed on that and certified before it even becomes into play. And we stepped up and said, hey, we'll host one. Like, can we host it? And we had it set up. We hosted it here. It was all remote during COVID, but it was hosted by Wausau PD. And we invited our whole network of SROs across the Northwoods here in central Wisconsin. And when you look at the training material, and as a team, we all recognize like any one of my officers could be the instructor training for any one of those courses. And a lot of it revolves around not just their experience, but also the training we've already gotten around CIT, decriminalizing mental health, things of that nature.
So what are the SRO's roles in child welfare issues? Do you get involved or engaged in those?
Absolutely, especially during the summertime, but if there's a CPS report that comes in, Child Protective Services report, that comes directly to the Investigations Bureau to triage and determine who gets assigned. So we look at that. If there's a child that is a Wausau School District student who's either a victim or involved, by default, we're going to look to assign that to the school resource officer wherever that student is as follow-up. Again, because we're going to leverage that rapport and relationship building. Even if they don't know the student, well, here's an opportunity to get to know that student and family who is obviously struggling. So we want to get to know them. So by default, it goes to them to investigate, to make contact with the parents. As a result, they have great relationships with all the CPS workers. They know them all by name. And they can go out as a team and make contact with that parent and come up with solutions together. So, yeah, that's another way we leverage that relationship building with them. So they will go out in the community. They're not going to be just stuck in the building. They will address that with CPS, whether it be a drug endangered home situation or abuse or just uninhabitable conditions. Our SROs are on a first name basis with some of our staff in our inspections department here. And it's not to go bring them along and say, enforce this and kick them out. It's let's all work together to come up with a plan. Let's contact the landlord, get them involved. And hey, we want this family to be able to stay in this house somehow because it's impacting how this child does at school, the behaviors he's exhibiting at school. He's throwing tantrums, he's out of control, he's not learning. Like, let's fix the home issue. And I can think of many examples, especially with our middle school officers, where it's the officer, it's the social worker, it's the inspections department person, it's the landlord, and they come up with an agreement with this parent, like, how can we get some of this cleaned up? How can we resolve some of this? Let's set some deadlines. And this is going to be a better environment for this child to live in, and we see the results at school.
Will?
All right, I have a few topics I wanted to kind of ask you about. One, bullying looks a lot different from when we're in school. And, you hear on the news, some of the more egregious stories about intense cyber bullying and stalking and threats and posting of pictures, and how that can manifest and, sometimes a student taking out their rage because they've been bullied or committing suicide or those types of things. Are you guys involved at that, or at what point does the school make those referrals to you on those types of cases?
Many times. When it involves social media, that's where a lot of times there's this cross of what used to be something happens in the school building or something happens in the community. Well, social media has changed that game, right? It crosses. You get things that happened at home at night or on the weekend. It gets reported to school on Monday. Certainly, our SROs are absolutely involved if it's threats, physical threats to school or other students. If it's, hey, it's an harassment type thing, it's just constant bothering, I don't know, it's hard to scale that. Lower level stuff, the school may just involve, it might be a school discipline issue, that is common. But they'll still typically loop in the SRO, just give them the information so they know, because he's one more adult in the building that can monitor some of that. And also still make contact with the people involved, the person who's probably the primary aggressor, talk with them, have a conversation about the dangers of what you're doing and where this might go. So they are pretty heavily involved in that. The higher level stuff, absolutely, they're going to be involved on the front end if there's threats to school safety or physical threats that students are making. So they do go, they've been to lots of training on that as far as social media, how to also not just address it with students, but also how to document that, find the information, dig into it, look through social media, capture that information so that it is useful and not necessarily for prosecution, but to be able to help. Our SROs are relied upon a lot by our school staff to find that information and help them make school discipline decisions.
Okay. And then if you could talk a little bit more about, because I know in the, in giving us, providing us information, you've given some, scenarios that you have been through. And I noticed a few of them seem to involve mental health issues with students. I know that now we deal, in terms of taking mental health issues, we take it a lot more seriously nowadays than probably did back in the day. And I know there's a lot of events like COVID and other things that have caused high stress on students. Are you seeing a lot more mental health cases, and what is the normal protocol in dealing with students, whether it's use of force or not use of force, in terms of when you're approaching students with mental health issues?
Sure. I mentioned before a joint training that we did with school district staff. That was in 2017, and that was in the midst of kind of the local crisis process improvement initiative, where we recognized, we saw this high number of students being taken out of school on 5115 basis, and we wanted to make sure pupil services staff, so social workers, counselors, people of that nature across the district and our SROs were on the same page, because we did see that where we felt sometimes school staff was calling a little too soon, like, hey, we don't necessarily think this should be an officer dealing with this right now. We really try to have the district put more plans in place. How do you take first steps to resolve this crisis, de-escalate, and not make it this child damaged this classroom, I want this officer to handle it type of thing. So that definitely helped, having that conversation and coming to a understanding of when is it appropriate to bring an officer into those situations, especially with younger kids. So we did see that was escalating, 2014, 15, 16, 17. Having that understanding with the district, they've put additional policies, procedures, training in place with their staff. I think we have a good understanding of how and when to use the officers in our buildings. We've seen with COVID, Wausau School District was out of building from March 2020 all the way, I think the whole following school year for the most part. So naturally, we didn't, have a lot of, we're not pulling kids out of buildings, but during that time, they were still assisting school district staff in monitoring struggling students and families that the district was worried about. If our SROs had good relationships with those families, they assisted in going out and checking on them, make sure they're doing okay, trying to encourage kids to log on and do those kinds of things. Now that school is back in session, we have seen an increase compared to the year before. So as far as mental health calls for service type things in the school, we've seen an escalation in that. But having an understanding of how that should be handled, we're not having the parallel increase with emergency detentions. Across school staff and our officers were able to, we realize we invest more time in that. We have more people are trained in a consistent manner to take the time as necessary to de-escalate and keep them in school whenever possible.
Okay. One follow-up to that, and then just one other question, then, I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
You had mentioned the joint training 2017. How often do you have those joint trainings?
On that particular topic with that was the one time that we had that particular training. It is now more common in the beginning of the school year. Our officers, they're there in student and staff orientation days. So this is something that the district and their staff training just kind of especially if they have new staff, here's the SROs, here's what their role is, and now that we have it, we have that in writing in our contract with the school. Here's what their role is. So it is the district that's pushing them down to our staff, but our officers are there during orientation. So once we had that initial training and understanding across the parties of what this should look like, now it's a simpler process, within those 4 buildings. Here's how the officer should be used. Those admin teams in the buildings are well versed in that distinction between discipline and enforcement and how we address kids in crisis.
Okay. And the last question, just wanted to go back, because you mentioned briefly the sexual assault are referred to DA. Can you tell me a little bit about that process, if you get a call about a sexual assault?
Sure. I mean, the most common way it comes up for an SRO is from a school counselor, or sometimes it is a student that comes directly to them. So you can break that down into, it was assaulted by, child was assaulted by an adult in a home out in the community at some point. Sometimes it's a delayed, through a counselor. It's like, hey, this happened to me last year, 4 years ago, something like that. Versus it was a sexual assault that was, contact with another student. both of those scenarios are something that our SROs investigate. So like, if it was assault by a family member, an adult, yeah, they're going to be, they're there doing the interview with the student. They're going to be contacting women's community as appropriate, bringing the parent, social services, going out and doing that investigation with, the perpetrator in that, going, locating them. They might have a patrol officer help them with that. And they're going to be there for that forensic interview with the child at the advocacy center as that, support and being that liaison with the parent to be able to explain the process. Here's the status of the investigation. Here's what I'm going to do next. Here's the process. So it's that same officer with that student, that family throughout the course of that. If it's a student-to-student interaction, yeah, they're very much involved because they're generally going to know the students. Those can fall into, it's kind of investigating whether it falls into voluntary, which are sometimes very easy. Both children, students are like, yep, we agreed to this. They both often get referred together for social services so that they can provide those educational programming. It's not, prosecuted at the D's office, so to speak. But they are in the best position to, as far as our allocation of resources of who's going to investigate that the most efficiently, have the best rapport with parties on both sides, being able to explain the process, and with their rapport, get the best quality information, that's the SRO.
Mike?
Thank you.
Couple of quick questions for you. Would you prefer your officers were in plain clothes, and why?
I would like to keep them in uniform. We've bent a little bit with, and been totally, because we're always open to new ideas. Certainly it's school spirit day, it's Friday, and we're talking about relationship building. Our officers, yep, we can do plain clothes, and they've been given the discretion on that. They don't have to come ask me for permission. It's homecoming week, there's this activity going on, they get to dress like that, they get to put on the flannel, or they go plain clothes, things like that. If there's a certain type of activity that they're involved in, if it makes sense, I give them the discretion to go in plain clothes. Default is still uniform. I think that it does, the quality of our school resource officer program now compared to what it was before they were uniformed, and maybe a good chunk of that is it's the people who they are, which are different than the officers and the training that were in it back then. But I find that it's a draw for a lot of students, especially those that are struggling and looking for someone to look up to. It's something else to talk about, to break the ice. Kids like to talk, especially younger kids, like they get excited by Officer Cornell coming in and he has some of this equipment, and it's just sometimes it's just a good distraction, especially with younger kids. Like, I don't see it as an intimidating thing, as long as it's the right person in the uniform. I think that's what really makes it. You have the right person in the uniform, I would, in my experience, I think that has been certainly beneficial, far more than having plain clothes. So I can relate that to, say, Officer Bertram on our CART team, who's plain clothes, will still often have gun, handcuffs, and things like that, but kids aren't running up to him. It's like, that doesn't look exciting to me. That doesn't look like, oh, here's a police officer, somebody that I would like to go talk to. I mean, if they have a dog, it's a benefit, obviously, too, but so that's on the relationship building side with kids. I think it's been an asset for us. I don't think it's been a detraction. Obviously, on the safety security side of things, it just, there is an emphasis on preparedness, emergency preparedness. Any of these critical incidents can happen anywhere. Two of our SROs are tactical instructors, which has been an asset. They not only train they're the experts. They go to the instructor schools, they train our staff, they train school staff. To have our tactical instructors be the SROs, I think, is a great asset, and they are training in this equipment with this gear. It is muscle memory. They know how to use it, when to use it, and if there is a critical incident, it's going to be automatic. And I think if they're in plain clothes when something like that happens, they're behind, and time is of the essence.
So you listed tobacco, disorderly conduct, and truancy. It struck me that maybe we should be referring tobacco to the health officer versus our police officers. I mean, what are we,
Yeah, that is something that has been consistent and there really hasn't been any change in. I mean, that when I did look at that, it caused me to think too, because I'll clarify. So municipal citations are not something that comes across my desk. That goes from the MDC in through the citation process. It goes to records. So I don't always see those. I don't read every citation they write. But when I looked up the stats and I saw all these and I recognized that. I think it's been a push over the years through AODA and tobacco, and they do these tobacco presentations at school. And the district has always just taken a no tolerance approach to that, and citation has been the route. I don't think anyone's ever looked at it that way. I think trickling backwards from THC, we've done that now with vaping, which is tobacco. So it was Nick Stetzer, it was his idea saying, hey, we have restorative justice and do these conferences with students on teen driving. Vaping all of a sudden last year or 2 years ago became a huge thing, and it caused a lot of we don't need to write a citation for all these. So I'm literally thinking this as I go along here, but we've kind of gotten there a little bit with vaping, and we're doing that. And so it would be easy to extend that to just cigarettes and tobacco in general. They're having these vaping restorative justice conferences where they take all of the students over the last quarter who had that. They have a citation issued, but as long as they participate, the citation is voided. So that the citation is already written out for the offense, the date, time. If they don't participate, the citation will go through. But they bring them in a group, whether it's 5 or 10 of them with multiple officers, and they talk about it. The kids get to explain their side of it. The officers tell them their tales of woe and what this could look like for them and the dangers.
two other questions, and then I'll be done. This is kind of along that same track, which is the 21st, or the policing report for the 21st century police, and I'm butchering that. The President Obama's task force put
Yes.
together a number of recommendations, and one predominant one that kept popping up was officers should not be involved in discipline, or it should be very limited. Do you think that there are things that you're being asked to do, your department's being asked to do, that are discipline related, that the school's asking you to do, that you feel that really you shouldn't be doing it and it's detrimental to the relationships you're trying to build with the community and the children?
I really think it's going well. I think that's gotten better and better, and that's a continuous improvement process. I think when I started in this role, I did see some of that, and we didn't have that in writing yet. That wasn't delineated, and I think it was maybe right around the time that was coming out. So the section you reference is exactly what DOJ took and put into, here's a model contract you should have with your school district. And the language in our contract on that issue, school discipline and how it should be handled, comes directly from that. So Wisconsin has adopted that as best practice. We've put it in writing. We've pushed it down to SROs and school staff. The district agrees this is in the best interest of students. I think it happens from time to time, but having our officers that they have multiple years of experience, they have the confidence to now they're educating teachers on this. Like, we're gonna handle this differently. Like, they have the ability to say no. Like, this is not something I should be involved in, and we're not gonna go there. This is a disciplinary issue. I think within those 4 buildings especially, I think our district admin there's long tenured people there that understand this. So I think locally, I think it's been very good. I think it gets better and better every year. So.
And then the last question I have is related to the school referendum. Just got passed, and the school referendum provided a abundance of funding, or not abundance, that would be probably a poor term, but more funding for guidance counselors, social workers, school psychologists. So we're expecting an influx of additional resources and support staff. What do you expect that to have in terms of an impact on the department and your actions with the children in the schools? And as a follow-up to that, do you believe that these mental health resources in the schools are adequately trained in crisis intervention, and are they responding in a predominant way to a lot of these crisis situations as opposed to law enforcement?
Okay.
There's a lot there, sorry.
Yeah, so question one is, how is that going to impact kind of our services and officers? And I mean, certainly, I'm in agreement that it's needed. I think it would reduce how often our officers are maybe called out to elementary schools. And sometimes it's simply because school is really busy and they have multiple kids in crisis and they have a social worker or counselor there, but they're occupied over here. And some of their social workers kind of rotate around schools. They might not have the person they need in building at that time. And so on this day, the officer might not be called. But if there's not staff there that can handle it, or they got multiple things going on, the officer might be called. So I think it will reduce the number of times our officers go there. I think we've adapted to that, where our officers have gotten very much aligned with some of the same skills and training and how to handle some of these situations as school counselors. Should it be that way? I mean, I think it's an asset that they've learned that. Certainly more pupil services, I think, are needed. I think at any given time, like I said, the middle school officers are the busiest, and that's because they're running from one to the next. When they're at one school, they're getting a call saying, and they have to say, sorry, I can't get there. You're going to have to deal with this on your own. So yes, I think to have dedicated staff in each of those buildings, especially the elementary schools, is needed. My understanding is more of a rotational. So ideally, it would keep our officers in their assigned buildings more. I think that's a good thing because there's plenty to do within that building and building relationships and helping their staff there. So yes, I think it's helpful and I think it would be an asset. As far as effectiveness, I think one of the struggles that I see is, just turnover in school staff. And our officers know the school counselors very well, and we have some that have been here for a while, but every year you get a couple of new ones that maybe they come from a different system, and the SRO is used in a different fashion. So every year our officers are kind of re-educating and reintroducing some of the staff on, here's how we do this. There are examples of the officers going to an elementary school and it's a newer staff person who's just not maybe trained or confident enough to handle this elementary school kid who's out of control, throwing stuff around, maybe punched her or whatever, and is in crisis themselves sometimes, and the officer shows up to this and you feel so bad for them. But we need the staff. We understand they have to be trained, and sometimes that's just getting experience. They're learning by doing. Are there kids that get impacted in that maybe don't need to be? Certainly. Training is one thing, but I think having that experience, it's hard to run through that scenario in training where you got a kid who's acting in that fashion. So,
But in terms of the response, is the response that the school staff are the primary in the de-escalation and the officer is there for public safety purposes, or is the officer taking over and de-escalating the situation in your experience?
I think they're doing a good job of the school staff are first responders. And I take that from our People Services Director right now is Angie Lloyd. Before her was Jeff Lindell. And both of them have been fantastic we give them feedback on, here's an interaction with the school staff person that we think maybe the officer didn't have to be there. They have always been very receptive to feedback, and I see that they push that down. They've always been in agreement with any feedback that I give them on, hey, maybe we could do this differently because it didn't have to go this far with this kid. So I think they've done a great job they act on that. The school staff is the first responder. They're not calling us and walking out. Usually the officer's getting there and they're getting engaged because they can see that this child has already overcome this staff person. We see some schools are better just because they have more veteran staff where we hear plenty of times from a principal, like this, I'm going to think of a fake name, but Oliver over here, who the officer dealt with, Oliver had a bad day yesterday and he was in this room and tore it all apart. And staff, once they get to know how to deal with them, they don't call us every time. I think they do a good job of that. They might keep the officer in the loop, but in my experience, they are always the first responders. They do a pretty good job of making decision of when to call us. They do not call us for every time a kid is out of control.
All right, thank you.
So do you provide any services to the private schools?
Yes. So, it's kind of, we've taken the approach of it's in our community. If they ask, as we have time, we'll help. We try to be a little careful with that, and we try to be transparent about it too. We recognize the district pays 50-50. But again, having that experience with child-sensitive investigations, we've responded to Newman's request for help in an investigation, whether it be a sexual assault, family member versus student, things like that. We don't get calls from the private schools about like theft, disorderly conduct, things of that nature. It'd have to be something pretty significant. But they do call us for, hey, when active shooter, armed intruder and training came around, they're like, hey, where do we go for this? We provided our staff and went over and helped train their staff and help them safety plan in their school, come up with a security plan, evacuation plan, things like that. Our officers have gone to like Trinity Lutheran and still provided some of the like 5th grade education on internet safety, drugs, tobacco, things like that. It's not often, but we'll accommodate the request as we're able.
All right. Any other questions? If not, Nick, thank you so much for that presentation. I think we all learned a lot, and keep up the great work.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. That'll take us back to the top of the agenda, and I see that Eric has not joined us, and I did have a conversation with him last week relative to the focus groups. He was just confirming what the committee had wanted, and he was working on trying to develop a strategy, and I put a call into him today, and I didn't get a call back, so I'm assuming that something came up and they're not here, so we'll have him at our next meeting talking about where the focus groups are. But I did want to ask if you had, as a result of reflection, any thoughts on whether there were any issues that were raised as a result of the survey that we should perhaps focus on as a task force? Or are there issues that we specifically want the focus groups to dig down into? I think that when you start looking at some of the things, the use of force, the perceptions, which sometimes become reality, were different among certain groups on the use of force. And then the whole issue of are we safer as a community today than we were a year ago? Are there other issues, or did you draw the same conclusions? Do you have any thoughts that we could pass on to Eric? Because I think he's desirous of getting those focus groups going ahead. And while you're thinking about that, one of the other questions, are there some educational needs that were identified in the survey where perhaps we need to do a better job of telling a story to the community about what's happening? And I think that, again, I would look at that issue of safety in the community. Is that a national trend, or is that a local, manifesting itself in a local survey, or is that actually a local trend or a concern? Any thoughts? Or do you want to keep?
What do you mean getting this out to the community? When we're done, or as we're going along, or?
I think it's part of our recommendations. Do we see any issues that were raised in this survey that, based on our understanding of what we've learned, perhaps there's a difference between what we've seen and observed and what the public's perception is, and is there a need for us to highlight any of those issues, and is there value in doing that? I asked that question because those were some things that I kind of was trying to go through again, the findings, and are there any things that we as a task force should be thinking about in terms of developing recommendations as it relates to the results of the survey?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we should do that. I do think that the user groups, that's probably a wrong term, but the focus groups, thank you. I'm in a different mindset there. But the focus groups are going to be helpful in putting some additional context in and recommendations. So I'd wait until we get feedback from those groups.
Any other thoughts?
So I'm at clarification. Are you wondering if we would take, is Wausau unique on some of this data? Was that one of your questions that you were proposing? So that, I mean, because there's always this, we can present data and we don't have a mean. We don't have a norm. There's going to be X amount of variability explained by that's just the way it is. And is that, like Wausau compared to a city between 25,000 and 50,000 across the United States, are they having similar, is that what you were looking at in the educational?
I don't know that I looked at it in the context of comparable communities. I was trying to look at it in light of the facts that we got on the use of force. How often is use of force actually used, or how often is force used in responding in Wausau? Just looking at it more in a microcosm of Wausau as itself, although there may be some merit into a broader discussion. But my thought was, are people's perception of police in Wausau driven more by their experiences in Wausau or based on the national press? And based upon some of the information that we've gleaned early in our process, it would appear that the use of force is relatively, doesn't happen very often in Wausau. So are there some opportunities for us to perhaps shed some light on those numbers? And is there any value in perhaps shedding light on those numbers to try to change the community's perception, or to have if the perception is driven, perceptions drive reality in the terms of who holds those beliefs.
I think we need to be very conscientious about how data is shared, because we still live in a town where people are scared of driving downtown because of the one-way streets. And so we need to give some people perspective of that there's, we are not an isolated community. Other communities are dealing with this, and the data's out there. You can find, the data's there to show use of force by city size and things like, and we've used questions from national surveys that have already been validated that we can then pull out and say, here's where we are standing versus the national average. And I think as on an educational level, to show people that this is an area of concern. We're way above, we're more negative than the national average perhaps, or we're more positive than the national average perhaps. It's not saying that it's still not an issue. It's just giving some benchmark for residents to understand what else is being experienced in the United States as a whole.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I have something to add to that. Just personally speaking, I don't feel like numbers, regardless of if it displays that there's less use of force here in Wausau, would change my perception. It's going to be personal interactions with officers. Like, I've never personally had an interaction that was negative with a police officer, but like with my family history and connections from other cities and states, I have. And like, that's what I carry with me, even though I know Wausau is not Chicago or Chattanooga or Tulsa. So I just don't know that we should get too far focused in using those numbers to essentially convince people that we're not as quote unquote bad as other places.
Other thoughts? We'll throw that out to Eric and crew, and I think Michael's comment of let's see where we are at the end of the day after the focus groups and how much enlightenment we get through those discussions might be worthwhile. Go ahead, Will.
I think I'd just like to add, I think obviously one of the things that, has arisen through a lot of talks is the mental health issue and how police have to deal with and interact with it in terms of people that have mental health issues. So I think that would be a focus. I think the other thing that I would kind of, when Eric comes back, like to kind of look at again is, and in terms of thinking about education to the public, in terms of what they see, because a lot of the response in terms of police is response based on calls. And so are people over-reporting, over-calling about things that really, they perceive because of stereotypes or whatever else, and thus then the police have to respond to those situations, and then now we're blaming the police for being involved in these situations, they're just responding to calls. And we, in terms of educating the community on, how these things are dealt with and why the police are coming out to these types of situations or these communities, educating the community that it may be, because we need to also deal with how we look at people.
Any other thoughts? All right. Speaking of mental health, we've had 2 discussions with Chief Blevin, Matt Barnes, the mayor, and myself with staff at North Central Healthcare relative to the items that were presented by Deputy Chief Barnes a couple of meetings ago, and they're in the process of developing some proposals relative to cart expansion and others, and we're looking at things that could address some of those other needs. And we'll, unfortunately, Matt is hunting today out in Montana or on his way back, and so his priorities, and Ben is recovering from ankle surgery. So we'll have a much more comprehensive update on mental health and some of the potential initiatives and recommendations that we may have, hopefully at our next meeting as well. But we have been meeting on that. Next, I'd like to go to just the review the legislation affecting policing. In your packet was the summary of the proposals from the speakers, task force on racial disparities, the subcommittee on law enforcement policies and standards. Not much has happened with those legislatively. Many of them have been introduced as legislation and taken to committees. But Mike, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, as I was going through this, I was thinking to myself, what do we do with some of this? And, a lot of this is a part of conversations that are happening not only locally, nationally, but certainly in this case at the state level. As I went through this, I thought that most of these things we were already meeting the standard or perhaps even exceeding it. And I thought what would be helpful is that, if we could validate that with the department staff to say, yes, if this were enacted, we would already be meeting or exceeding the standard. And then there are a couple things in here that I think are really not within our purview to do at a local level. So for instance, statewide standard for use of force. I think those are recommendations, whether it be a resolution or some type of act that we could make or action that we could make or refer to another body that could support some of this legislation if we feel that we're appropriate. I think there are a couple opportunities for that. So I would first start with asking the department to give us a quick assessment of whether or not, if these were enacted, we would already be at or above the standard, and then we can look at the ones that are remaining as a committee and make recommendations if appropriate.
Any thoughts? And again, what we did was we captured, as we did with the President's Commission in the Wisconsin Professional Police Association's blueprint for change, all of the recommendations, whether they were reflective of a local issue or a state issue or other initiatives. So this was all of them that came out of that task force?
I would agree with Michael. I'd also add that I would be interested in the leadership of the local police department, their perspective on these proposed actions. In that sometimes people who aren't police officers make rules for police officers, just like for teachers and for doctors and for whatever, and some interesting insight on what these might create, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Not saying that but just so we have an understanding of their feedback, that we aren't going down a path assuming that the legislature has the best intent for the officers in mind.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So I will ask Ben and Matt to come into the next meeting and be able to talk about where are we meeting or exceeding the standards, what are their perspective on the recommendations, and potential impact to the police department, and which are relative to our work and which are not. And that should be easy enough. And I think we started that process with the other recommendations, and we'll continue that. And I'd like to have them here for the discussion on the other recommendations for the WPPA Blueprint for Change and the President's report on the 21st century policing. When we prepare this, I guess we had forgotten that they wouldn't be available on the agenda and would have modified it. But I think it was important for us to hear from Lieutenant Seiler and his efforts. Any other thoughts on a process forward?
Just a couple of things, and this more is probably along the lines of a resolution, in terms of support to state, national. I think at one time, Chief Bliffen had mentioned the fact in terms of like there's no national or state ethics board per state. So like for lawyers, you do something no matter where you are. Before you can become a police officer somewhere else, you have to go before an ethics committee. There's a whole process with that. Having that for officers, because it's kind of disjointed at this point, and you can kind of go somewhere else and know Joe at this other police department and get hired. So I think that was mentioned, and also in terms of just the decertification training, I think Chief Bliffen had mentioned that our police department goes a little bit further in terms of training, but it's not a requirement in terms of the more hours that they require, but to have that be something that more, on a more standard level throughout that is committed to. And I think he did say something along the lines of if there was a, I can't remember if it was more funding for a set amount of training hours or set training program that they could have every year. When he comes back, I'll have to ask about that. But along the lines of support, when you mentioned in terms of training, but also oversight, or some things that maybe we can recommend, and on our level, but also and provide support to Chief Bliffen and other officers here, but also then in terms of resolutions on a state level.
Do you mind if I cut in for one moment?
You may.
I would like to strongly urge you to consider what our task force member, Will Harris, has just told us. So since we've started this task force, both Chief Bliffen and I have been appointed to the Law Enforcement Standards Board. And one of the discussions we continue to have is, do we want to have a state kind of organized or sanctioned decertification process? And right now, staff at Law Enforcement Standards Board is saying we can't handle that. We don't have the funds to do it. But in my mind, it still seems like a better option to have that more objective. So however we get there, I would be pleased to deliver recommendations in that level or wherever we need to deliver them. So just thanks for suggesting both of those.
Okay. I think once we hear from the department, we'll make that recommendation. In light of the fact that we have legislation that is currently before the legislature, how would we advance a resolution of support? Would that go directly from us? Would that go to the city council for action? How would we proceed?
We have a couple of options. It could be something that maybe our Public Health and Safety Committee would consider if it made sense to go through that committee and then to council. We do have a legislative committee that really hasn't met for years, but I would be willing to have them meet to talk about all kinds of things. But yeah, we have a couple options. I think going through a committee would be the best approach, but we can make sure that happens. If you have a recommendation, we can bring it to them.
All right, anything else? Good discussion. All right, if not, I think we're going to skip over the other recommendations tonight. Our next meeting is scheduled for 6:30 on the 25th. And we will continue our discussion on the recommendations, and we will look to potentially get into some recommendations for the next year's budget as it relates to the crisis assessment team expansion. And I think there's some exciting things that might be coming forward at that time. So anything else to come before us? If not, a motion to adjourn is in order? Moved by
Second.
Mike, second by Pat. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you.